Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining today. This is our webinar. It's the first in a three-part series called Dimensions of Executive Presence. Today, we're focusing on just one of the three dimensions of executive presence called character. Today's webinar is called Character Matters. For those of you who don't know who we are, I am Greg Owen-Boger. I am the EVP of Learning and Business Development here at Turpin Communication. Co-facilitating with me today is Dale Ludwig, our president and founder.
Hello.
And
Good to
we
see
also
you all.
have Kevin, sorry, Dale, didn't mean to interrupt you.
No,
We
it's okay.
also have Kevin Vogelsang, our director of operations today. He is no longer on video for good reason. He is taking care of us today as host. So if you have any technical issues or need help with video, audio, whatever, please feel free to send him a private chat through the chat function. So let's go ahead and get going. This is our first, as I mentioned, of a three-part series. Today, we are in Character Matters. Later in Q2 and 3, I'm sorry, later in Q1 and 2, we will work on building credibility and showing up for others. All three of these webinars will be starting at 10 a.m. Central. So for those of you who are not familiar with Turpin Communication, we are a communication training and consulting firm. We do a lot of coaching on executive presence, and we work with leaders and emerging leaders at all types of organizations across the globe. We do this by focusing on communication, helping people improve their communication skills, whether they are presenters, meeting facilitators, or trainers. And over the years, Dale and I have co-authored a handful of books, and you can see them on the bottom of the screen there. So today we've got some learning objectives. We are going to work on three things, bringing them all together, and we're really just going to focus on or really think of them as leadership communication. So if we think about leadership brand, we want to help you be more intentional about developing your unique career building brand. In terms of executive presence, we want to figure out what does it mean for you wherever you are on your leadership journey. And we want to help you nurture work relationships through more effective communication. And at the bottom of the screen, you can see all of this wraps up to enhancing your communication skills. So the agenda for the next 55-ish minutes or so, we're going to talk through some guiding principles of effective communication. Then we're going to work on goal setting and professional branding. Then we'll introduce you to this model of executive presence. And then Dale is going to walk us through, dive into 5 of the facets. And then we will round things out by showing you some tools and resources. So let's go ahead and get at guiding principles of effective communication. So Dale, I'm going to stop sharing and let you drive things for a few minutes.
Got it. Thank you. Let me get my slides where I want them here. Here we go. And then move your videos over to my other screen. And we're going to start talking about communication. I don't think you can really talk about executive presence unless you have some sort of foundation of communication and what business communication is all about. The connections that we make with the executive presence resources that we have were so welcome to us because we finally found a way to weave that into the work that we do as communication consultants. Now, this slide, this continuum, indicates that in work, in our business lives, we communicate in a variety of ways, some of them very informal and some of them very formal. On the informal side, we have conversations and chance encounters, things that are not really planned necessarily, but nevertheless have a business purpose. Then on the other end, we have very formal communication and with speeches and with TED Talks. Most of us don't communicate in this way very often, but it does happen in the business world. And the reason we're bringing it up now is because we want to talk about that big space in between the informal and the formal. And we have defined those processes as orderly conversations, and there are many, many types of situations that involve this sort of interaction. As you can see with these images, starting at the top, we have a woman talking to a group of people seated at a table. At the bottom, we have one guy working virtually, and then we've got one-on-one interactions and hybrid interactions over on the left-hand side. So there are lots of different types of orderly conversations. The thing to remember is that their purpose is always to get business done. They always have a practical goal, and they have the characteristics listed at the bottom. They are planned and structured, but they're also responsive and interactive. And this next slide talks about the tension between those two things, because on the orderly side, you have a type of communication that is prepared. It needs to be accurate, and there needs to be some structure. In other words, you can't just let things go without any sort of form, you know, holding it all together. On the other hand, though, these interactions have to be conversations, genuine conversations between people. So that requires engagement, spontaneity, and interactivity. So as you can see, that arrow that looks pretty small in between is actually pretty big, because the tension between these two processes is really strong. And it's one of the main things we need to grapple with if we're going to improve an orderly conversation in the business world. So as you prepare, what does this mean practically? Well, it means when you prepare, you're always looking ahead to the uncertainties of the conversation. Now, that's very much unlike a speech where you are preparing to deliver something that is absolutely rehearsed and perfect. So for an orderly conversation, it's a different process. You're anticipating what might happen. And then once that conversation starts, you're adapting the plan to what's happening in the moment. And it's your ability to do that that determines your success. So success occurs through the conversation. It has to, it cannot be prepared for. You can't guarantee success through preparation, because you have to consider that the interactive, the unpredictable part that takes place when you're actually having a business conversation, which means business communicators succeed on two levels. Level one, the plan, is the one we're all pretty familiar with. You want to achieve whatever goal you're taking into the interaction. So you might want people to buy or agree or align or learn, whatever that is. That's why you're having this meeting or delivering a presentation. Now, the process side is really important, especially when it comes to executive presence, because it's there that you need to manage the conversation. Breaking that down a bit, you want to create the conditions for fruitful discussion, which happens in the moment. You want to earn trust and goodwill, make it easy, nurture relationships, and manage the give and take as it happens. And as we move through the executive presence facets that we're going to be going through over these three webinars, you'll see that there's a strong connection between that process, the right-hand side of the slide, and what's going on with executive presence. They both require a high level of self-awareness, and they both require adapting your your habits, your natural strengths, your bad habits maybe, that need to be adapted to succeed in the communication environment that you're in. Another big idea for our work, and we're going to include it here, is that you want to find your focus, be yourself, only better. So if we start in the middle there, be yourself. When it comes to successful communication, or when it comes to improving your executive presence, you have to have a good idea of what you naturally do and what you do well. You also have to know what you need to focus on to improve, which is what the only better part is about. Because you can't, Greg will talk more about this, but you can't read a standard issue executive presence book, and there are a lot of them. You can't just read one of those, take it all in and apply it to your situation. You have to know what works for you, which is what the only better part is about. And finding your focus is simply related to that, because that helps you know, gives you insight into yourself, tells you where to focus your energies so that you can get comfortable in a situation, so that you can be yourself, so that you can manage the process. So find your focus, be yourself only better is foundational to the work that we do. Also, foundational idea is you need to be engaged. Now that has to do with finding your focus and being yourself, because when you are fully engaged, as it says on the right, you're able to think on your feet. You're in a communication situation. This woman is delivering a presentation. When you're in a business communication situation, you need to know what to do to get your head together and stay focused. So when you are engaged, you're in the moment, you're self-aware, you're in control, you're connected with individuals, which means you can read the room, which is really important. You're talking with and not at, which goes back to that distinction between the speech and a conversation. Speech makers are sort of talking at. They're not adapting to what people need or questions they might have. They're simply delivering information in kind of a one-way process. And finally, you're feeling comfortable. So when we talk about foundational concepts with executive presence, realize that you're not able to adapt to them or bring or highlight them or make them better without being fully engaged in the moment that you're communicating with somebody. Goal setting and professional branding belongs to Greg. Greg, do you want to add anything to what I just said, or?
No, I don't think so. I do want to get at professional branding, though. I think it's foundational to the work that we are here to do today. We need to start, though, with some goal setting. So I'm going to ask you a question here and give you a moment just to think about it, which is, how would you like to be described by the people you work with and for? Just think about that for a moment. As you do that, Kevin is going to drop into chat my response to that question. And if you open up chat, you can see that I want to be described as easy to work with, likable, that's a rough one for me, professional, grounded, trustworthy, authentic, and smart. Now I will invite you to drop into chat your responses. How would you like to be described? Scott says easy to work with, engaging, adaptable, genuine, and super cool.
Super
Well, Scott,
cool.
I happen to know you. Super cool is top of the list there. Kim, we have caring. Oh, they're coming in fast. Genuine, challenging. Anne says grounded, present, intuitive, approachable. Mark, oh, they're coming in fast. Easy to work with, honest, direct. These are all terrific descriptors, and feel free to steal from each other if you want. Doug says attentive, kind, approachable, helpful. We've got authentic, trustworthy, fun, supportive, a developer, compassionate, straightforward, fair, brings out the best in others. Oh, I love that. I love the idea of that. Present, professional, but fun. We can have our cake and eat it too there, Jennifer. Approachable, competent, and helpful, encouraging. Okay, so you get the idea. So what you have just done here is you started to define your professional brand. Now, your version of your brand and someone else's version of their brand could be very, very different. And that's why we have this film strip running across the bottom of the screen here. You can see we have four very different types of professionals in an organization, but they look very different and with different ages. And so what I want you to take away from this is your unique brand is absolutely unique to you. It is yours. And it needs to be consistent, though, with the type of organization that you're working in. In other words, you don't want that to be inconsistent. And if it is inconsistent, then it's something that you might want to think about moving forward. So there we have your professional brand. Now let's move into the next level of this, which is executive presence. So I am going to give you a definition and show you the model, and then Dale will dive into some of the facets in the character dimension. So if I were to ask you, how would you define executive presence? If you're like me from several years ago, many years ago at this point, you probably would struggle. I don't, some of the thoughts that I had in my mind were concepts like owning the room, someone who's well dressed, there's gravitas, they're credible, confident, an excellent communicator. And while all of those things, one way or another, I think can be true, they don't actually get at a very good definition. And, for years, our clients would come to us and say, can you work with so and so or this group of people on their executive presence? And we were always very concerned about saying yes to that, because if we can't define executive presence, how in the world can we coach somebody or help them achieve it? Well, we fixed that problem because I eventually found this book, All the Leader You Can Be, The Science of Achieving Extraordinary Executive Presence. And one of the things that grabbed me at first in the bookstore was this is written by a woman, Suzanne Bates. And all the other stuff, the other resources that were out there that I found were all written by old white guys. Now, I don't want to dump on old white guys. You're listening to two of them right now, although one of us is older than the other.
Thanks.
Let's say
Yeah,
I'm
that's me. That's me, everybody.
let's say I'm on the aging side of that. But anyway, my point is that so much that is out there was these, older guys who happened to be white talking about themselves and how they achieved leadership. I didn't find that helpful at all. But when I landed on this book, I started to really get excited because the work dovetailed very nicely with the work that we do. And we'll dig into that notion as we move forward. But I want to give you the definition here by Suzanne and her team. She says, executive presence is the qualities of a leader that engage, inspire, align, and move people to act. That is a very different definition than what I showed you on the previous slide. She goes on to say that by understanding how our intentions as a leader match up with other people's perceptions, you can learn how to flex your style to gain trust, build alignment, and lead change. So I want you to take away two things from this definition. One, your executive presence is based on other people's perceptions of you. And by growing your own self awareness, those perceptions can be improved over time. And that over time thing is important. You don't just show up one day with executive presence and then let it fade away. It's something you build up, which is exactly what you do with your professional brand as well. Now, one of the questions you may have swimming around in your brain right now is, why are two authors talking about somebody else's book? That's a legitimate question, and the answer is that we are certified and partnered with the Bates organization now to be able to show how we can take this notion of executive presence, place it within business communication to help our clients and you grow your brand of executive presence. So here is the model. As you can see, there are 15 what the Bates organization calls facets, and they're broken up into three categories or dimensions: character, substance, and style. And obviously today we are focused just on the left side of the screen here, the character facet. What I want you to think about though is that all of these facets or these character attributes show up in meetings, which is why we can talk about how improving communication can help us build executive presence. Now, I think it's really interesting that they call these things facets because each of us is a unique individual. We've already established that. And as you can see here, we've got many jewels on the screen, and they are cut with facets, and each one of them shows up in different ways. So each of them has presence, and yet they look very different in the same way that all of us are. So if we add that to our notion of our film strip here with these different people, you can see that everybody, regardless of industry and their own personal brand, can in fact grow their brand of self-aware, of executive presence. Now, there's one more concept I need to introduce you to before I turn things over to Dale, and that is this idea of an overstrength. So you can see that overstrength has an arrow there pointing to assertiveness. Throughout our time together today, I'm going to share with you a few stories, personal stories about myself and my experiences. Here's the first one, which is as I was understanding this concept and applying it to myself, I I learned something that I didn't actually like very much about myself, which is I have an overstrength in assertiveness. So I always thought that my level of assertiveness was a plus, and it can be, but I tend to push a little too hard. And when you push too hard in one particular facet, it sort of turns upside down and becomes a potential negative. So assertiveness, I always thought that was a strength, but my coach helped me understand that not so much. We need to tap the brakes on that once in a while. But there are times when we need to place an overstrength within business context. So how much you choose to flex on an overstrength can be different based on your role and what you're trying to achieve. So for me, I just need to keep in the back of my mind growing my self-awareness around my tendency to over lean into assertiveness and simply pull back from it uh, most of times, but know that if it's needed, I can lean into it as well. So this notion of an overstrength will start to really take hold as Dale moves forward here. But before we do that, I do want to mention that we have a handout. We're not going to give it to you now because it might be too distracting for you. We'll give you a link to it a little bit later. But every one of the facets we're going to talk about has a page dedicated to it. There's the definition, what it is, what it isn't, and how it can express itself if you happen to have an overstrength. And the most important part are the behaviors and techniques at the bottom of each page that will help you improve the perceptions of each one of the facets. So with that, Dale, I'm going to stop sharing and send things back over to you.
All right. Let me bring up my slide. And I've got, oh, good, you're already over in the other screen. Good. All right. All righty. So let's dive into those five facets and see what sort of practical application we can find for each one of them. Oh, wait a minute. I put my slides in the wrong spot. Forgive me. Didn't advance quite far enough. Here we go. All right. Character. I'll begin by defining how Bates defines character, and then I'll dive into these facets themselves and talk about all the things Greg just mentioned. Character, as you can see here, are the qualities fundamental to a leader as a person, their identity, and give us a reason to trust them. Now, what that means is that when your character facets are strong, you build trust and goodwill. These facets are developed early in life and make other people want to work with you. So when we look at how each one of these dimensions works, the one on the far right in this model, the style one, is the most observable. Character is the least observable of the three. But I do want to emphasize as we move through each of these actionable things that you can do to improve each of them. Okay, we'll begin with authenticity, being real, genuine, transparent, sincere in your relations and interactions with others. That seems obvious. The behaviors and techniques, though, that you want to apply, and this is all in the handout, and I am pulling out from this already shortened list compared to the handout. It's the ones I want to talk about today. As you can see here, telling compelling personal stories to reveal who you are can improve your authenticity. Connecting with people, especially through eye contact, making that connection again with communication skills. Are you able to really connect with people, and are they able to connect with you through your eye contact? And expressing empathy and vulnerability. And I want to emphasize the last one just a bit because it's about expressing empathy and vulnerability. It's just not about having being vulnerable, excuse me, or feeling empathy. You need to express those things in order to come across as more authentic. And I think that those very simple strategies that you can use that may not be entirely natural for you. Maybe you don't want to express vulnerability. Nobody wants to, but well, actually, it's kind of helpful when you're working as a trainer to express vulnerability, but we can get into that at another time. But it's all about making sure people understand that about you through your actions and through your words. Now, if we go into more detail here, not enough authenticity can lead to mistrust, the perception of being cold or disengaged, others wondering who you are or what you might be hiding. Each of these, that one gets a little bit painful there. People think you're hiding something. You might want to make sure that you're opening up so that they don't have that perception anymore. And I think that being cold, another example, is I think we have worked with people in the past and people have given them feedback. People tell me I'm cold. I don't know what they mean by that. And it might mean that they are not expressing enough about themselves. They're not showing interest in others quite as much as they could. And all of that can affect the impression of authenticity. Now, going to the overstrength, what does an overstrength in authenticity look like? The perception of being fake or phony or oversharing. Oversharing is an interesting one because I've written about it in the articles we're publishing about these things. And that is that you want to be careful that you're not making every conversation about yourself, which is kind of the example that I use there. You don't want to talk too much about what's going on with you at the expense of talking about what's going on with others. And that's just a personality trait that's common for some folks and not so common for others. And we'll be talking more about that in a bit. But you can see here how authenticity is defined by Bates and how it applies to the communication situations that you're in. You want to talk about grace, Greg?
Yeah, I would. At the risk of making this all about me, I said I was going to tell some personal stories. And so, at the risk of that, I do want to share with you an experience that actually Dale, Kevin, and I had with a woman We've changed her name and her image to protect her, but we were working with Grace a few years ago on this particular concept. And a little something about Grace is that she is an attorney. She works for a very high-powered law firm, and she happens to be the only female lawyer and the only person of color that works at the entire firm. And when we were talking about authenticity, she said, "Whoa, whoa, 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 whoa. There is no way I am going to bring 100% of myself into that organization that I work with. That would not be safe for me." And it was jarring for me at first to hear her talk about that because I had always taught authenticity as, we should bring 100% of ourselves to whatever situation we're in and be 100% authentic. And it never occurred to me that that could actually be a scary thing for some people. So I was quite naive about that and grew my own self-awareness around authenticity at the time. But what she said is, look, I will bring certain portions, most of me, to work. And those portions that I do bring will be authentic, but I am not going to bring 100% of myself. And I think that is a really critical thing for some of us to think about and realize when we are working with other people that it's okay for people to hide certain bits. And if we think about this and take race and gender out of it, I may have had a really bad conversation at home in the morning. That is something I should not be bringing to work because it can poison the day for me and for other people. So we might want to think about not sharing whatever that difficult conversation was. So that is a story about authenticity and how we can think about it for each of us as individuals and how much are we going to share with other people. So Dale, I'll turn things back over to you.
Okay. I just want to mention a couple of things. The facet of authenticity has a lot to do with your personal experience, your personal life, what you talk about. And I was just thinking the oversharing thing, if we put Grace at one end and an oversharer on the other end, we're talking about the same qualities. And you have to be careful how much you bring of yourself. And I think nobody brings everything about themselves to work. But I think the stakes might be a bit higher for Grace because of the environment that she's working in. And it's also interesting on a sort of meta level, Greg, what you're revealing about yourself by telling the story about Grace, because you're showing a bit of vulnerability. You hadn't thought of it that way. All of that, and that's important. Or I learned something. So all of it is of a piece, and then it has to do with our own the impression we're making as an individual. Thank you for that. I'm going to go on to integrity. This one seems like an easy one to understand. Acting with fidelity to one's values, living up to standards of truth telling and promise keeping. In other words, you do what you say you're going to do. Now, there are two layers of integrity. One is the moral one, doing what's right. The other is the behavioral one, doing what you say you're going to do. Now, the moral one, I'm not going to emphasize on the upcoming slide because most of the time people are acting in a moral way. Although in my first job in business, I was working with salespeople who I thought didn't show much moral integrity because they were willing to exaggerate what the company that I worked for was able to deliver. And then it fell on me as the trainer to deliver something that was impossible to deliver. So there's a bit of a disconnect there. It's like I wanted to say to them, why are you making things up? You, you know we can't do that. You can't make things up just to get the sale. That's an example of moral integrity, but behavioral, let's look at that. I only emphasize one thing here, showing respect by being on time and fully present. Never before Bates, thought about this as integrity. I'm showing a characteristic of integrity. But it really is, because if you are constantly late, or if you're kind of checked out during the meeting, it's going to erode people's impression of you. And this is a very, very simple thing that you can do to make sure that you don't chip away at the impression of integrity. And you can look at all these other things on this list from the handout that you're getting. Not enough integrity, the perception that you cannot be counted on. People don't trust you. You might experience isolation because people don't want to interact with you. So if that's the way you're going to behave, people start to step away. And that's a challenge. Now, an overstrength, which is interesting for integrity, because you'd think, well, how could you have too much integrity? Well, first, you might be perceived as stubborn, having black or white thinking. Like you think you know the right way, and no other way is even possible. Letting perfection be the enemy of the good. We've all seen this in our jobs, and taking too much and talking too much. Oh, that's a typo. Taking on too much. No, it's not. Taking on too much, and as a result, letting people down. This is an interesting one as well, because if you feel like you're the only person able to do job X, you won't let anybody else take it on. That's a problem. You can't do all those things, and you ultimately let people down. So you have to think about take a fairly broad look at your behavior and how you function in the workplace to really focus on some of these aspects of integrity. Greg, do you want to talk about Gary? I'll stop
Not
sharing.
really, but I feel like I need to. Yeah. So Gary is someone, again, protecting the name that is not an image of the real Gary. So we're looking back about 25-ish years at this point. Before Turpin, I was working with Turpin, but Turpin wasn't as successful as it is now. So I was actually splitting my time between two consulting firms. The other consulting firm, oddly enough, was a leadership development firm that will you'll understand
The
why I'm
irony.
giggling, right? As I tell this story. But anyway, this particular person, Gary, he was one of the founders of the consulting firm, and he was a very likable person. Jovial, gregarious. You wanted to be with him. And that was actually an overstrength of his, actually, because what would happen was he would overpromise things that he would do. And because of his jovial personality, he was the life of the party, life of every meeting, and every meeting dragged on and went overtime. And then you well know how those meetings can stack up. And so at the end of the day, you're way behind. You haven't had time to do anything that you wanted to do because this guy, Gary, had slowed everything down all day long. So fast forward to a client meeting. I was, again, very young in my career. I was not leading at all of this particular meeting. I was there basically as an admin. But we were with a client, or I should say I was with a client, and 15 minutes later, Gary shows up. Gary shows up with wet hair and a hot steaming cup of coffee. And you think about this and it's like, you are not showing respect for the rest of the people. You're not showing respect for the client. You mismanaged your time by getting in the shower late, and you didn't care about our time enough to get to the meeting a few minutes, maybe a few minutes late. You actually went to Starbucks and got coffee for yourself. So you can see that behavioral integrity over time chips away at goodwill. Now, his intention always was good to be the people pleaser and to say, yeah, I'm going to do that, but he rarely actually followed through. So over time, a loss of entirely all of it, the goodwill. Now, fast forward to just a couple of years ago. So a couple of decades have spanned, right? He happened to come across an article that I had written in a magazine, and he thought, gee, I'd like to collaborate with Greg and maybe even build a business out of that concept. I had no interest in that whatsoever because I don't want to work with a guy anymore. So you can see how this lack of behavioral integrity can really chip away at how people perceive you, even though your intentions could be very good.
Thank you. Another good story, Greg. Let's move on. Let's go to concern. Demonstrating interest in others, promoting a healthy, sustainable culture. Okay. One bullet point here I want to emphasize. Creating the conditions for a fruitful discussion to take place. This is a communication skill, and we teach this concept, and we will be covering it in one of the later webinars as well. But need to take control of whatever meeting or whatever presentation you are managing and thinking enough about the people you're going to be working with to make life easier for them as the meeting proceeds. Now, there's a lot that we've written and currently writing about meetings and how to make them better. But one thing to remember is that you have to take into consideration how people are feeling when they walk into your meeting, what you need to do to bring them into the process, and don't assume that everybody is ready to go as soon as you say, let's get started. You have to work, bring people into those conversations. And I think that demonstrates concern for them. You know, and it reflects your insight into them. Now, when you have too much concern, a few things can happen: making decisions that affect others negatively and being unwilling to have conversations about it. In other words, you're kind of chickening out. I'm not going to talk about that because it's a little bit uncomfortable because it has to do with how they're feeling. And that's a negative. Having a cold exterior, listening poorly and bulldozing others. It goes back to Greg's comment about assertiveness sometimes. Interrupting, not following the conversation, being in your own little world, not paying any attention to others. So obviously, a concern has to do with how you're connecting with the other people you're working with. Now, if you have an overstrength, you might be perceived as being too touchy-feely, or you're unable to make decisions that will affect others negatively, which is the opposite of the bullet above, in that, oh, this is going to upset the team, I'm not going to do it, rather than this is a business need, I need to make this decision, and I'm going to bring the team along with me. So it's about how you manage that connection you have with the people that you're working with and how you demonstrate it in meetings, how well you listen, how well you care, how much you care about what other people are saying. One final thought about this: you want to show concern for others through small talk, or what we call chit chat before a meeting or before a presentation. We're listening and probing and so on. And this has become a more and more important concept for us because if you think about the orderly conversation, which is how we look at the business communication, there has been a conversation happening before your presentation or begins or before your meeting starts. And you need to put your whatever you bring to process that day in the context of that larger conversation. So that chit chat, that interaction that occurs, we need to be aware of what's being discussed, apply it to what we're going to be talking about. Just a quick story for us. When we go to train people and we bring in our video cameras, nobody wants to be with us. Nobody wants to be video recorded and have to watch that video. So being aware of that, or being aware of what they say about that process before we even start, is really helpful, because then we can acknowledge that concern. We can maybe address some of the issues that have come up, but it's a way for us to meet people where they are based on what they've said before the meeting started. Let's look at restraint. Displaying a calm disposition characterized by reasonableness and by avoidance of extreme, extreme emotions and impulsiveness. The, in other words, can you keep it together? Can you not get too upset when you're in a work environment? Now, two of the things we're going to talk about here are pausing and thinking before you speak. Sometimes it just takes a minute to catch your breath, collect your thoughts, and then respond. And being patient and letting others have their say. So it's about what you're saying and when you're saying it. It's also about listening. And you can get, when somebody starts a sentence that you know is going to go a place you don't want to go, you want to make sure you're focusing on them and not on how you're going to respond to them, which is, we all know this, as Trevor talked about, improving your listening skills. Try not to think about your answer when someone is still asking the question. So it's about, again, taking that deep breath, letting things happen, trusting that your response is going to be fine after you take in whatever information needs to be taken in. So those are two things that you can do to improve the impression of restraint. Not enough. Outbursts, being impulsive, relying on knee-jerk reactions, not being able to stop yourself from saying too much. In other words, you're losing control a bit in all of these situations with all of these examples. So be aware of that and keep it together so that you can stay in a useful position within the conversation that's taking place and not blowing it up. Too much restraint. Others feel they're receiving the silent treatment. Others not knowing where you stand or where they stand with you. Negative assumptions being made about you. So you want to make sure that you're communicating how you feel. You want to make sure that you are interacting with people in a realistic way, but don't go so far will be so restrained that people have no idea what's going on with you. Okay, let's go to the last one. This is humility, showing awareness of your strengths and weaknesses, and openness to others, and the belief that all people have worth. Let's look at these bullets. Being curious, being unafraid to admit you don't have the answer, listening well without interrupting, even when the message is hard to hear. The bottom one I just talked about with restraint, making sure that you stay focused even when things are getting slightly uncomfortable for you will help you communicate humility because you're not jumping in and trying to correct things that be the one in charge, be the boss. Now, the top two there, being curious and being unafraid to admit you don't have the answer, are pretty practical skills, techniques that you can use in any meeting. Just make sure that you are genuinely interested in what other people have to say. I never really thought of that as being something that communicates humility, but it is because you're relying on them. You're not simply relying on your insights, but you're using their insights as well. It's being open to what they have to say. Now, obviously, too much humility, not enough humility means you're going to be perceived as arrogant. The And I know that some people, when we work with folks in a workshop and they say, "Oh, I don't think I'm arrogant," and I'm not. Our job then is to watch them, observe them, and figure out, well, how are they making that impression? How are people taking that away from what people are saying? And sometimes it's really simple skills that they need to apply. So that's the too much, or not enough, rather. Too much, the overstrength leads to lackluster leadership, the perception of indecisiveness, the perception of having no opinions or not having no opinions or not valuing your own, which is interesting because if people don't participate, it's like, well, are you being too humble? Do you think we don't care about what you think? I mean, it's not all about us either. It's about you. You want to participate. Discomfort with praise or acknowledgement of a job well done. This is really common when people don't know how to take a compliment and or people, downplay their success. You don't want to do that too much. You don't want to, shout hallelujah about yourself all of the time. But on the other hand, you want to take those compliments when they're coming to you legitimately. So think about whether you have that as an overstrength with humility. Greg, I'm going to turn things over to you so you can talk about Marianne.
All right. Well, Dale said, we believe it or not, we can actually have an overstrength in humility. And that actually shocked me when I was first introduced to this concept. But I realize now I actually had an experience with a leader who did have an overstrength in humility, and it did not turn out very well for her. So we'll call her Marianne. So Marianne was the president of a professional organization, and I happened to sit on the board. I eventually became president a few years later, but at this particular time, I was a director level, and it was a very large board, about 30 people. And while Marianne had the best of intentions, I think, in terms of being inclusive with the board meetings dragged on for hours because she wanted everybody's opinion. She wanted everybody to have equal airtime. And the intention there is very good. By the way, intention is one of the 15 facets that we will talk about in a later webinar. But anyway, the board meetings, because she asked for everybody's opinion and then everything back and forth, everything took too long. Everything would grind to a halt. A decision might not be made, and we would have to come back the next month and revisit it, and then the whole thing would happen again. In emails, Marianne would often prelude so many of her thoughts with, "In my humble opinion," or the whatever it's called, the letters IMHO. And you're looking for a leader who actually leads. And when someone doesn't express their own opinions, that's lackluster leadership. Again, the intention was good, but the result was not good. And if there's one thing you take away from today's conversation, is that we have to make sure that our intentions are actually resulting in the perceptions that we intend. Otherwise, there is a disconnect in how people perceive us. Now, In almost all of the stories we have talked about today, there is a singular thread that is weaving through them, which is this. Someone in each of these stories was lacking self-awareness, right? Whether it was me on the naivete around authenticity or the other individuals that I talked with, it was a lack of self-awareness, which is why growing our self-awareness around how people perceive us is absolutely critical to figuring out how to grow our own executive presence. So with that,
Greg,
I
can
am
I
go
interrupt for just a second?
yeah, please.
When you were talking about Marianne, I was thinking about um, a woman who used to work with us who began almost every sentence with "I'm sorry."
Yeah.
And, and I'm sure you all know, we've all seen people like this. This is pretty common. But eventually, it's like, stop apologizing. Absolutely no need for you to apologize. But it was just a habit that she had and really needed to overcome it and be aware of it so she could stop. But it was hard to do. Once it was pointed out, she had a really tough time with it because if that becomes your habit for whatever reason, it's hard to break.
And it led to a perception of inauthenticity, right?
Right.
Because
Because if you're apologizing for everything, you're apologizing for nothing. Yeah.
right, right.
Yeah.
All right. Let's bring this whole conversation home, shall we? So I said earlier when I first started the webinar today that we're bringing these three meaty concepts together and really placing them within leadership communication. And it's my hope that we have sparked some thoughts for you in these variety of concepts that we've talked about. And we asked you, how do you want to be described by the people you work with before? And your responses are the beginning of really codifying or documenting your own version of executive presence and your professional brand. And I would encourage you to continue to build upon that definition that you have started for yourself. And if you need to go back and get it, it is still in chat. You can scroll up and get what you put into chat. Um, the other thing is we mentioned this handout, and today, obviously, we only focused on 1/3 of this entire model. The handout does have the entire model, though, and I would encourage you to download it, read it, think about how do these facets actually play out for you as the unique individual that you are. Now, we're going to round out things. I've mentioned this a few times today, but we're going to talk through building credibility, which is the middle column, the substance column of the model, and then showing up for others, which is style. That is, it involves appearance and demeanor, but a whole lot of other things about how you make people feel when you're communicating with them. Now, here, what you've all been waiting for are the tools and resources. So I can see that Kevin dropped into chat already for us the registration for those other webinars. Now, these are all going to be recorded. So if you can't attend one, that's perfectly cool. The recordings will be available. And the recording for this one obviously will be available for other people who have not attended today but want to attend the others. Here's the handout that we've been talking about. Kevin is going to drop a link into that. Feel free to download these things as I continue to talk here. There is something that we didn't really mention. Dale touched on it, but I want to go into it a little bit deeper, which is Dale has masterfully written a very in-depth article on every single one of these 15 facets, and they are available through the link that Kevin just dropped into chat. He is, as you probably noticed as we talked about this, is that there are threads that are woven throughout this entire model. And when you pull on one thread, it actually has an impact on other facets. So the blog articles do an incredibly good job of helping us understand all of those concepts, and lots of stories are added to those as well. Now, I did not, when I was talking through stories, I did not introduce you to our story planner tool, but we are going to give you access to it. We're actually going to teach you how to use this tool in another one of the webinars in this series. But for those of you who are interested in getting better at telling stories, and as you can see, stories do not have to be long and they don't have to be complicated. They just need to get the job done. This story planner tool will help you do that. Now, As if that wasn't a commercial enough, I've got another big one coming up. We are thrilled that we are about to introduce an entirely new program for you and all of our clients and potential clients that are out there. So this is what we are calling the new and improved eCoach. It is a members-only website that you can join and have access to all kinds of stuff. And we've broken all of that stuff into two categories. There are tools, which involves an AI tool that I'm going to show you here in a moment. There are going to be on-demand courses, tools, guides, downloads, and our archive of all of our intellectual property are going to be available to you. We also have access to free and reduced pricing events, including a few things that you can see there, and I'm going to talk about a couple of them here. So here is a screen grab of me, not looking kind of dorky, I get it. This is TurpinBot. This is the AI tool. It learned all of our methodology and our intellectual property, and so it actually can coach you almost as well as we can. Not as well, but close. It's the AI tool, and if you've tinkered with AI tools, you know how impressive they can be. But anyway, you can work on a meeting, a presentation, a training session. You can even practice one-on-one high-stakes conversations within TurpinBot, and it will give you feedback. You can see there on the right-hand side, there's a ton of feedback that it's giving me, and that feedback it comes in both quantitative and qualitative feedback. So the AI tool, TurpinBot, is available to you within eCoach Communication Toolkit. I mentioned some of those events that we're going to have. This is one that is absolutely free, and it will be only available to members of eCoach, which is what we're going to call office hours. We're going to run them monthly. So you'll have access to one of the Turpin coaches. It might be me, or it might be Dale, or maybe somebody else, for 30 minutes. So you can bring any challenge you've got. We'll go into a private breakout room and we will figure it out. This is not launched yet. Actually, none of this stuff is launched. We wanted to launch it by earlier this week, but that didn't happen. And if you've ever been involved with the development of a website, you know how that is. This picture is less dorky. Thank you, Scott. I appreciate that. And one of the other things we're going to offer is what we're calling crash courses. These are half-day virtual courses that will be available at a substantial discount for people who are members of the new eCoach Toolkit. Now, if any of that sounds like a really good thing for you or your organization, or you want to talk about anything else for bringing this type of training or coaching to yourself or your organization, we wear multiple hats here at Turpin. One of my secondary hats is I'm the sales guy. So Kevin is going to drop a link to my calendar into chat where you can just schedule some time to talk with me. All right, that brings us to the end of not only that commercial, but also our webinar today. And we intentionally are ending a few minutes early for good reason. One, you need time to download all the stuff that we're giving you. Those links will also be available in the email that we'll send you tomorrow along with the recording. But we also wanted to give you a chance to get into your next thing. So if you need a few minutes to get a reset to move on, that's good. But Dale and I and Kevin are going to stay here in the Zoom room for a few more minutes. So if there are questions that you have, you wish we would have answered, but we didn't, we are welcome to stick around and answer anything, or just general comments that you want to make. That's perfectly fine too.